happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. Oh, happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. I've got more than my share of happiness.
Good evening and welcome to Late Night Catechism, the show where we go where angels fear to tread. So as you know by now, this is the 7th episode. Can you believe that? This is the 7th episode. I find that incredible. We've already done 7 of these shows. And yet in many ways for me this still feels like a new show, but such is the nature of lockdown, I suppose. We lose track of time, every day being a bit like Groundhog Day. Thank goodness for the liturgical calendar, because at least that is still progressing, and with its progression we note the passing of time, but still nonetheless here we are with our 7th show. And Late Night Catechism, basically, to sum it up in a nutshell, of course, is to discuss those subjects and answer those questions that ordinarily we might be a little shy of asking, certainly in a public forum. So last week we discussed the tripartite nature of ourselves as body, soul, and spirit, or body, mind, and spirit. And this week I want to continue kind of on that theme by talking about self-awareness, because the point, of course, of last week's show was to make the point that the Christian life is all about becoming whole, that actually body, mind, and spirit are supposed to work in harmony together, and that the purpose of the Christian life is to enable and to facilitate that harmony, so that we're not at odds within ourselves. Because let's face it, as we all know, I'm sure, that is the nub of it. Quite often we want to do better, we'd like to be better, we want to stop doing things that we oughtn't to do, but we just can't find the will or the ability or the strength somehow. But part of the reason why we give in so easily to what in the church we call sin is simply because often most of us don't understand how it all works. That may seem a strange thing to say, but many people don't probably really understand how sin works. I just want to read you something from St. James's epistle in the New Testament. James chapter 1 verse 15. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Now, key perhaps to understanding that verse is, what is desire? Where does that come from? What is desire? And essentially, it's our passions. Our passions. Many of these are a natural condition, we might say. Certainly, they reflect a natural aspect of ourselves. But remember that not everything that is natural is necessarily good. When you read in Genesis, the Lord God made this, that, and everything else, and he saw that it was good. Remember last week how he then made man in his image and likeness, and saw that it was not good. Now, the reason in Genesis why God says it's not good is because he goes on to say it's not good for man to be alone. Not good for man to be alone. But there is something to be said that our natural condition, as it were, is unfinished. In fact, in part because of the fall, we don't exist as God had originally intended for us to exist. We are made in his image, and really we aspire to his likeness. The image part, of course, being that spirit part of ourselves that is of God, being ourselves creatures created by him and of him. But the likeness, well, that is what Christianity is all about. Christianity is all about becoming Christ-like, which is all about becoming the perfection of humanity as God had originally conceived us to be and to live. And this is why Christianity may seem to some to be obsessed with this notion of righteousness and holiness, because it's all about fulfilling that charge by Christ to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Essentially, it's to realize what God had originally intended for us, and which we believe as Christians is what we will receive when the kingdom comes, when Christ's kingdom finally comes. The whole of creation will be restored, a new heaven and a new earth. And as St. Paul says, this corruptible, meaning ourselves, will be made incorruptible. But in the meantime, of course, it's something that we need to aspire to achieve that perfection, to attain that perfection. And we want to achieve it, we want to aspire it in order to become one with God. Remember, the scripture tells us that God is love. And indeed, St. John says, God is love, and they who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. That really sums up the purpose of Christian life. That's what we're aiming for, is to realize within ourselves the full image and likeness of God, the likeness of God being love, and being sacrificial love, being selfless love, being a self-emptying love, being a true love, a love that is not interested in itself for itself, but gives and lives for others. This is a key thing to understand about the Christian life. You know, we are striving, we are aiming to be perfect. And yes, we know it's difficult. We know it's difficult, but that shouldn't stop us striving, because we may glimpse in this life, and we may experience glimpses of in this life, the perfect nature and likeness of God in us. And this we particularly see and experience in acts of true charity, of true sacrificial, selfless love. It's that, as I sometimes call it, that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you genuinely do something for somebody else with no expectation and no desire for self-gratification, for self-satisfaction. You know, when you go out of your way to do that special thing, or to find that special gift for a friend or for family, for a loved one, and they, you know, it's the best thing since sliced bread. And that sense of excitement and anticipation, that sense of warmth and comfort, even that we feel when we're about doing that sort of thing. And then when we give them the gift, and we give them the surprise, and their reaction and their response, you know, that's, God desires us essentially to experience that all the time. That's what God really wants us to achieve, as it were, in this life, is that sense of real, genuine, true satisfaction, not the self-satisfaction that we generally aspire to. Now, one of the ways in which perhaps it's easier to understand the nature of desire is to understand the nature of passions. Now, in theology, basically we've these passions are identified as 8. I mean, from these 8 passions, You could you could certainly describe other expressions of them. But essentially, these 8 passions are where the origin of desire comes from, which then, of course, eventually manifests itself more often than not in sin. So it's important to understand and appreciate these passions, because it then will help us to recognize when we're in danger meaning temptation to sin. It will also help us to understand the nature of sin itself, and that's how we can avoid it. So I'll go through these 8 passions, and this is the whole purpose of this, is really so that we can have a better self-understanding, a truer picture of ourselves, to gain true self-awareness, in order then that we can control ourselves, in order that then we can take control of ourselves and discipline ourselves and enable that righteousness that we want to seek after, that holiness we are pursuing, that perfection to grow and to manifest within us. So the first passion I'm going to talk about is gluttony. And straight away, I'm going to put my hand up and say, yeah, I identify a lot with some aspects of this particular passion. Of course, the other thing to remember with each of these passions, as we'll see as we go through them, there will be an important distinction that we're going to make as we go through them. So gluttony then. Gluttony. Eating, of course, is natural. It's natural, and of course it's necessary. But when it becomes excessive and an uncontrollable bodily impulse and indulgence, it of course creates problems. And this includes overeating and drinking. Now, certainly I'm guilty of overeating myself. I'm the first to admit I'm more than aware. And it's, you yourselves, will I suspect, as we go through them, identify particularly with one or more passions. These are useful, for example, for identifying habitual sins or vices. Those things that we always do. We're always repeating the same thing. One of the things about hearing confessions is that one can identify people's particular areas of concern that they might need to address spiritually when one hears them regularly, because one identifies the habitual sins, the habitual vices, and then one tries, as the confessor, one tries to tackle the passion that's behind those habitual sins. Mine particularly is gluttony. I love food. I love food. Not all food, but a lot of food. I eat most things. I eat almost anything. I'm not particularly fussy when it comes to food, and but I just love food. I do. I love food. I love taste. I love the taste of food. I love the feeling of satisfaction when you've had a good meal. And food is my sort of go-to if I'm feeling, despondent, or if I'm feeling indulgent, etc. Then food is what I will go to. So gluttony, I know, is the passion I have to watch for myself. It also includes drinking too much, and by drinking too much, of course, we're not talking about water. Drinking too much is, of course, reference to alcohol, really, and alcoholism, which, of course, is a negative result. But it can also, of course, manifest itself, gluttony, as eating disorder, as an obsession with food and drinking. Now others who are more prone even than I, perhaps, to this passion, may indeed end up with eating disorders, with an unhealthy relationship with food. Whether some people, bless them, they just don't know when to stop. They just don't know when to stop, and often they are eating for the sake of eating. They're not eating because they have to eat, and even sometimes when it gets really bad, they're not even eating because they want to eat. But it has become, as it were, that's when it's become a vice, when, as it were, it's got control of them. And then that could be signs for that in someone, perhaps, secret eating, not just snacking between meals, but but eating meals between meals. And of course, from all of that, there could be a cascade of health problems can derive from basically obesity, which is what eventually it'll manifest itself as. But as I say, gluttony also includes drinking, binge drinking, alcoholism, even drug use. Even drug use, narcotic use, is a result of gluttony. That may seem odd because you're thinking, oh, well, a lot of drug addicts don't eat, really. But that's just the point. It's that the drug, as it were, is a substitute, or becomes a substitute for food. But then they start having a relationship and a regard to drugs that otherwise normally they would have with food, so that drug becomes the go-to. Now, St. Nailos, an Eastern saint, he says about gluttony, "For when the belly is inflamed by luxurious foods, the mind loses all power to conceive what is good and is paralyzed in its spiritual efforts. Once it gains the upper hand, it drives out self-control, moderation, courage, fortitude, and all other virtues." And it's because, it becomes obsessive. And when it being obsessive, it becomes eventually possessive. And that's true of all the passions. Passions in excess become obsessive. Indeed, one can notice that when something becomes an obsession with someone or for someone, it's not very long before it becomes a possession, where in the sense of it possesses them. We see this particularly with alcoholics, with extreme eating disorders, and with serious narcotic abuse. And you can see that people, they can't think straight for themselves. This is often the problem in trying to help people to overcome gluttony and overcome this possession through vice. Is what's difficult for them is they can't see it. They can't see it. Anyone who's worked with alcoholics and the rehabilitation of alcoholics, one of the key things one has to wait for. So bad is it? One has to wait for an alcoholic to realize themselves and accept themselves that they are an alcoholic. And it doesn't matter how many people, how many times they are told they're an alcoholic. You have to wait. Everyone has to wait, as it were, until they come to accept and to realize that they have a serious problem. And the same is true for narcotics abuse as well. They get to a stage where they just cannot think of anything else, and they cannot see how that which they have become seemingly to rely on to live can be bad for them. And that's often how it begins. That's the change from obsession to possession is when they can't imagine living life without their fix, whether it's food, whether it's drink, whether it's drugs. They can't function without a fix. The truth of course is they could, but they can't see that. And as with all the passions, eventually one of the things that becomes an issue is mental health. And sometimes, sadly, it can take a long road to recover. For some people, it manifests itself physically, and it becomes obvious physically. It becomes even obvious to themselves physically, especially those with eating disorders. But when it begins to possess them, and it takes over, their mind, then you're into the realms of mental health, and then it can become very, very difficult to address and to help them to help themselves. Really, when it gets into the realms of mental health, they're not going to be able to help themselves. And this is one of the things so often that I've had to explain to family, to friends of narcotics and abusers and alcoholics, that when it's reached the mental stage, when it's affected their mental state, they can't reason themselves anymore. So you can scream and shout blue murder, begging them to stop, but they won't know what you're talking about. They can't see it. They can't compute. They can't recognize it. They are possessed by it. And this is, very true. Gluttony is the most obvious passion where this manifests itself. This result can manifest, but the same is true of the others too. So, one of the things to be careful of, and if like me, if you're able to recognize, if you know yourself well enough to be able to recognize the passions that you need to be careful of, then you need to be careful then to make sure that you check yourself. You check your own behavior. One of the saving graces, perhaps for myself, is the various times of fast throughout the church's year. And I know, before anybody says it, I know you can't see it. But I do fast. I do fast when I'm supposed to fast, and Holy Mother Church directs us to fast. The trouble is, of course, is I make up for it the rest of the year. That's the problem. The idea of our fasting times, it's, aside from the spiritual, is the fact that they are good for us in so many other ways than just spiritually. And the idea is that, as I always say about Lent, Lent is not just for Lent, it's for life. What we learn in Lent about self-control and discipline, etc., really is, at the end of Lent, we shouldn't think, oh, I can stop that and give that up now. Because the whole point at the beginning of Lent was to identify what you needed to take control of. And then in Lent, to hone, as it were, that self-discipline through sacrifice, by denying yourself it, whatever it is. And the idea of afterwards then, it's, for some people, 40 days is not enough to, properly embed a change in habit, or a change in relationship or understanding or appreciation of something. Which is why I'm always very clear in Lent to say, Lent is for life. It's not just for Lent. because what you've done is you've identified a problem, now you're addressing it. Now you need to keep applying the cure. That's the whole point. Now, another obvious passion is lust. Sexual pleasure with a view to procreation is, of course, natural, but it becomes destructive when movements of the flesh lead to unchaste indulgence in sensual pleasure. Now, as you know, my intention, I'm more than aware, although I am broadcasting live 9 p.m. in the UK, which is kind of watershed. As I've said before, other people watching in other places around the world will be watching at other times of day. Likewise, this is recorded and is available anytime afterwards for anybody to watch anywhere. And I can't help that, really, from my end. So, as I've said before, I tend to be circumspect, sometimes a little, rather than direct when talking about certain things. Now, you'll forgive me if today I'm going to slightly modify that to say that I'm going to be succinct rather than subtle. So if I say something that shocks you, remember, probably it's only a little shock, and you're only shocked because normally I would be much more subtle. But in being succinct, sometimes it means, to be succinct is really to cut through. So with regard to lust, now of course we've kind of spoken about lust before in earlier episodes, when we've been talking about celibacy and chastity, when we were talking about sex and relationships and identify as knowing ourselves, etc. And very often I've used subtle phrases like physical self-gratification. Now, we've already discussed in other episodes what the proper order or what the proper use of sexual intimacy, for example, is for. It's for procreation. It's basically for a couple, for a man and a woman, to become one flesh in a kind of literal sense, which is, kind of obvious biologically, and then from their love, from that act of making love, is the euphemism we used to use for it in gentler times. Making love, then of course would conceive a child, hopefully, all being well. In other words, the child is the fruit of their love, and in this way, a married couple, as we said last week, reflect the Trinity, really play a beautiful part in cooperating with God's will and in God's love, because with the birth of a child comes a new soul to the world, and is another extension and manifestation of God's love, and that's really what procreation is for. Is a collaboration in the highest form, we might say, in one sense, of realizing the likeness of God in humanity, the ability to be able to create new life. So that is the proper order and nature for sexuality and for sexual expression and intimacy. Self-gratification is not what it's for. Is not what it's for. Lust. What does lust do? Lust overpowers the mind and reason by carnal desires. Lust is the opposite of love. In many ways, lust is the antithesis of love. And this is one of the things that I think most people struggle with, is lust, and struggle to understand why it's an issue. There's a lot of talk, at the moment. People have been, protesting and demonstrating about climate change. There's a lot of concern for the environment, so on and so forth. What people don't often realize, is that the reason why the material world is in such a bad state, why creation is in such a bad state, is because of us giving in to our passions, because of us seeking pleasure, self-pleasure, and comfort. Wanting those things, being consumed by the want of those things, of those desires, as the scripture says, as James 1:5, as I said at the beginning, desire conceives sin, sin conceives death. By this constant pursuit of self-gratification and self-satisfaction and self-pleasure, we have exploited the world's resources. That is, and I've said so many times that what the school children, for example, demonstrating about climate change, what would be better is if they actually attacked consumerism, attacked commercialism, if they acted against the constant pressure in our materially driven society for self-pleasure and self-satisfaction, because it is that consumerism that is basically driving death, bringing death to huge swathes of the planet, to insects and species and birds and bees and so on and so forth, that is destroying forests, etc., etc., all in the pursuit of our bodily passions, all in the pursuit of our wanting to eat more and cheaply, wanting to wear more and cheaply, wanting to face paint ourselves, makeup, etc., 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 wanting to beautify ourselves, wanting to make ourselves appear more sexually attractive. You think about it logically, it's these things that drive the markets, that drive the inventions and the creations and the increased productivity of products, and all of that eats the world's resources. And people seem to, have a sort of disconnect mentally between how things are made and where the ingredients to make them comes from. And of course, it comes from mineral deposits. It comes from the ground. It comes from trees. It comes from, all these things. And in turn, of course, all that does is exploit. So, that consumerism, so this greed, this lust, as it were, and gluttony, all these things, all these passions, they drive all these market forces that then despoil creation in order for us to feel slightly better about ourselves. That's the nub of it. This is why, my brothers and sisters, that the church has always taught what she has about being wary of the passions, about self-control, about discipline. Why? Because humanity is called by God, as Adam was, to be stewardship of creation. Not to exploit creation for our own satisfaction, but to steward it, to treat it with respect, to treat it carefully, to use our higher ability, to use our higher intellect, not be driven by our base instincts, the passions, but rather be driven by a higher sense of self, of ethic, of morality, which, rather than exploit the earth and exploit resources and destroy creation, instead will enhance. Again, we would grow more in the likeness of God by enhancing creation. I mean, we can see in art, in the arts, and even in the sciences, we can see how used properly, used in the right way, used in a positive, constructive way, we can enhance the world around us. We can beautify the world around us. That's one of the amazing things about humanity. What we see in the arts and sciences and inventiveness in those positive, constructive ways, we see the true vocation of humanity as steward of creation, working, collaborating with God. You see, it's then manifesting communion with God, which is why we exist. That's what we're here for. And at the same time, all those things, benefit everyone else. We're all moved and touched by art, by paintings, by music, by the positive results of science and invention. And all those things of themselves are good. It's when we abuse them. And what drives that abuse? Selfishness. And where does selfishness come from is pleasure. What is pleasure about is self-satisfaction. It's about the passions. Do you see how it all works? And this is why Holy Church for centuries, why the scriptures, why divine revelation. Divine revelation is God constantly saying to us, look, think about what you're doing. Control yourself. Control yourself and everyone can enjoy creation. Control yourself and everyone can benefit from creation. And what does that then betray but charity? What does that then betray? True love, selfless love, the nature of God himself, the likeness for which we are striving to grow and develop and to manifest. So, lust, of course, this includes adultery, promiscuity, addiction to self-gratification, and all these things, of course, then result in exploitation and abuse. Not just abuse of ourselves, but abuse of others and exploitation of others. As I don't think I mentioned it last week, but here in Brighton, people don't realise. You won't realise wherever you are, wherever you are in the world, and you watch this. I bet you won't know. I bet most of you won't know the level of sexual exploitation that is going on around you. You probably won't know. You won't know how many children are being sexually exploited and abused. You won't know how many vulnerable adults are being sexually exploited and abused. And yet, in subtle ways, you'll actually be aware of it all. But because of the nature of our society, in its now, anything goes morality, you're not aware of the exploitation. You won't be aware, for example, of the exploitation of your own children. Children sexually exploiting each other. Young adults sexually exploiting each other. That's without talking about perversions and paedophilia and all the rest of it. Promiscuity in our young people today is phenomenal. Here in this country, in the United Kingdom, we consistently have the highest teenage pregnancy rates, and that's part of the reason why we've had a record year last year, 2019, for abortions. Over 200,000, 99% of which had nothing to do with potential threat to life of the mother or the child, or of mental health and distress, etc. None of that. Less than 1% had anything to do with those sort of situations. The rest of it, through sexual exploitation. And some of that, of course, will be through abuse. But in fact, any sexual exploitation is abuse. Whether it's of ourselves, doing it to ourselves, or whether it's someone doing it to somebody else. And it doesn't matter, people have made such a big thing about consent. It doesn't matter if it's consensual. It's still abuse. It doesn't matter if I want to do it to you and you want to do it to me, and it's still abuse. Because what is the drive here? What is the motivation here? Most of the time, it's not love. Most people confuse lust for love. Most people confuse lust for love. Most of our young people, certainly. And the trouble is now, though, we've got generations now, because society itself has, fallen for that trap. And this is where, this has undermined society, undermined us in so many ways. Because we've convinced ourselves, oh, well, it's okay because I want to do it. As if that somehow morally justifies it. This is the problem with lust. And of course, as with all the passions, eventually it becomes obsessive. There are many more people today actually, actually self-aware enough to recognize that they have a problem. That now there is a psychological condition of sexual addiction. Psychological condition of sexual addiction, which is now can be addressed by counsellors. There are whole streams of counsellors everywhere now. And people find they can't control themselves. It's a particular problem amongst young adult men. They can't control themselves. And the trouble is, of course, is that what it does is that it undermines all virtues. And because it moves from obsession to possession, it becomes ultimately destructive. Even in the obsession stage, it is exploitative. But then it becomes, in the possession stage, it becomes destructive. And people cry, beating themselves up over it. And ultimately, of course, what it does is that it prevents people from being able to love properly in the right way. It's known, this is proven, this has been documented by scientists and psychologists, etc. That the people who become obsessed, gradually who then become possessed, it warps their appreciation, understanding of relationships. They can't have a proper relationship. It destroys lives. It destroys marriages. It destroys families. That's ultimately what adultery does. It destroys trust. It breaks people's hearts. Young people, they often bless them because they're naive, etc., and they confuse lust for love, and their hearts are broken. And sadly, for many, from their teenage years, by the time they are young adults, they become immune to it. Because they've had their hearts broken so many times. They no longer know what real love is. And even if they were to find it, they don't know what to do with it. because their whole interpretation and understanding of it is through lust. That's why you hear, people say, "Oh well, we're breaking up because I just don't fancy them anymore." And yet at the beginning it was all, "Oh, love, love, love." No, it wasn't. It was lust, lust, lust. It's a trap. It's a particularly dangerous one. You look at the number of broken families, the number of children who come from broken homes, where one or other of the parents is absent. The security, the stability, the comfort and the consolation that a home and a family is supposed to provide, that's gone. Almost to the stage today where it's getting to a level where most children, in particular communities and cultures, have no real concept of family. And is it any wonder then, you see, because that has a knock-on effect, doesn't it? Because then when they attempt to have families or create families, they don't know what a family is, so it falls apart. They don't know how to have a relationship because they don't know what love is, because they've only known lust. So the relationships fall apart. And all this has a knock-on effect. And it is destroying our society. Now, I don't want to get political, but part of the reason for the anger and for the frustration and the underlying condition that is driving a particular part of humanity at the moment to protest in anger is because in so many ways they have been manipulated and exploited to such an extent that they are no longer able themselves to help themselves, because their culture has been destroyed, because they have no notion of family, no notion of relationships, no notion of responsibility. You look what the sociologists and the anthropologists and the psychologists, etc., are saying about, I'm going to say it, black communities. See how many children, particularly young men, are brought up with an absentee father, with a poor mother who's slogging her guts out to try and provide for them, to keep a roof over their head. And it's passions, etc., and desires that eventually lead them to fall in to the ever-decreasing spiral of sin. Wanting more all the time, wanting better all the time, but not being equipped to achieve it. It's an awful situation. But sadly, it's becoming a phenomenon, not just in the black community, but in white middle-class suburbia as well. Because all this comfort, all this pleasure just brings with it content and discontent. Because people just want more and more and more. So we come to avarice. So gluttony, lust, avarice, materialism. The pursuit and the desire to own and possess things. And, as I've already more or less explained, you can see how this becomes exploitative. You can see how this becomes abusive. You can see how this obfuscates people's moral sense. What do we say? What do people assume? What do they say when they want to insult somebody who's rich or wealthy or whatever. How many people did they trample on to get where they've got to? Oh, they'd sell their own grandmother. And the trouble is, of course, with avarice is that avarice as well, of course, engenders and inspires jealousy, covetousness, envy. So it becomes infectious. Everyone just becoming more and more greedy. Everybody wanting more and more and more. And the knock-on effect from that is then it then becomes exploitative. It then becomes abusive. And again, ultimately, damaging the world, spoiling the world for everyone, spoiling creation for everyone, abusing, exploiting the earth's resources, and exploiting each other. Dehumanizing others for the sake of our own pleasure. Now, another passion. St. Maximus says, listlessness alone seizes control of all the soul's powers and arouses almost all the passions together. Like spokes on a wheel, discontent can produce any passionate state. So a chadia is kind of the proper term, but spiritual discontent or apathy, listlessness. And this is a vice, more of the soul than of the body, though it affects the body, and we manifest it through the body. And ultimately, it's laziness, listlessness, laziness, can't be botheredness. And it results in ungratefulness, and eventually mental negativity. And this manifests itself as irreverence, grumbling, cursing, gossip, boredom, and abusive behavior towards others. It's a particularly insidious passion, a chadia, because on the one hand, although it is a passion, we don't think of it as a passion. We don't think to ourselves, oh yeah, I understand that's a passion because everybody wants to be lazy, everybody wants to be listless, everybody wants to be, abusive to others. But nonetheless, it works as a passion. It drives. It's a driving force. It's strangely, it's a kind of motivating force. Listlessness and laziness. Now, again, without wanting to cast aspersions, but they're clearly manifest in large swathes of our society today, where the original intention of trying to, again, see, driven by passion, driven by comfort and pleasure, societies want to create a common standard of living. And then doing that, of course, they wanted to provide assistance to people to be able to maintain a certain standard of living so that they could enjoy good health, so that they could enjoy good mental health, etc. Even though perhaps they may be out of work or unable to work, etc. But it actually has created a situation where it's bred listlessness, and that listlessness has infected then subsequent generations. Again, the studies are there, the scientific material is there. There is a certain, as I say, a certain portion of society where this is particularly manifest. But again, it's also true in other spheres of society as well, where we might not expect it to be. The incredibly rich can also be full of listlessness, full of laziness. Because if you have the power and the ability to be able to pay others to do everything, what do? And again, you see, it's this exaggeration of pleasure, isn't it? You know, it's this wanting to achieve a certain level of comfort and satisfaction. And again, of course, if you have everything and can buy everything and don't have to do anything, it dullens the senses and deadens the mind, or dulls the senses and deadens the mind. Because you've no need to inspire. What do you need inspiration for? You don't need to be creative, because you just pay somebody else to do it. And of course, listlessness like that, then other passions, connected, as it says, like spokes on a wheel, discontent can produce all the other passions, because then the other things come to the fore: gluttony, lust, etc. So achadia, listlessness, laziness, particularly insidious passion. Anger produces blindness of the mind and darkness of the heart. Now, anger, you see, is an interesting passion, because on the one hand, it can produce those effects. Because it's often a manifestation of pride and vanity that makes us angry. When somebody, we think somebody is disrespecting us, when we think people don't respect us, etc., that we get angry. And the trouble is, of course, is that if left to fester, it can become embitteredness. Anger that is left unmanaged, anger becomes dangerous, and it becomes conceitful. It becomes, it manifests all sorts of negative attributes. It's anger, for example, that drives revenge. So anger, there's blind rage is anger, and people in a blind rage are blind. They can't think clearly. They can't, they do erratic things, and that can be ultimately damaging for others around them. Again, anger, unmanaged anger can become a powder keg, an emotional maelstrom. So many domestic violence abusers, often the problem that's driving them to manifest violence, even amongst even of those that they in theory love, is because of some deep-seated unreconciled problem from their past. We often say about bullies and etc. that they were victims themselves. Sexual predators were often victims themselves. Pedophiles were often victims themselves. All this unmanaged emotion becomes ultimately destructive, self-destructive, and destructive of others and other things. Now, the flip side of anger is that as a passion of the soul in righteousness, it can be a positive driving force. It is possible, we might say, for somebody to be driven by a righteous anger. Somebody who's driven by a righteous anger to, against poverty, for example, may be able to produce all sorts of positive results, being driven by that righteous anger. The problem, of course, but understand that this is the difference between righteous anger and anger per se, because righteous anger is controllable and would exercise judgment and prudence. It's not a blind anger. Righteous anger is not a blind anger. So anger, another another passion. Despondency. Despondency often comes when other passions have reached the stage of possession. So when someone is consumed by listlessness, when someone is consumed by gluttony and lust, or even anger, despondency can settle in. In many ways, despondency is as a result of the other passions, where those other passions have become exaggerated, and as I say, have become reached that possession stage, and effectively become like a disease. And so they infect everything. They infect everything with negativity. They infect everything with a possessive way. And the trouble with despondency is often the person suffering from it is unable to see, unable to recognize. And this can manifest itself in mental health. So whereas with the passion of gluttony manifesting itself possessively in alcoholism or in narcotic abuse, and the mental effect is actually part, it's physiological, it's both physical and psychological, so that somebody just can't compute properly, they can't think properly. Despondency kind of works in a similar way, but results in despondency, we might say, results more in probably feelings of depression, extreme depression and anxiety, where again people can't see the wood for the trees. It may manifest itself indeed in a physiological way. We might even say in a dualistic way, because it affects the soul and the body together. And that makes it very difficult to address. And the opposite to, as it were, to despondency, we might say, is vainglory, yet another passion, self-esteem, vainglory. The desire for worldly recognition and praise. And of course, it's very closely linked to pride, which is the next passion we'll discuss. But the two are very similar. The problem with vainglory, particularly, is that it is a manifestation. It is a result from otherwise what might be positive self-esteem. It's a particular danger in the spiritual life. When in the spiritual life, again, if your approach to the spiritual life is about ticking off boxes, if your approach to the spiritual life is, in monitoring your spiritual life, it can become a temptation to fall into, to tick off boxes, and they say to yourself, oh, well, I've managed to overcome this, I've managed to overcome that, I've managed to do this and do that, do this and do that. And from that you get this good sense about yourself. The trouble is then it becomes self-esteem, it becomes this vainglory. And you begin then to lose sight. So actually you're not making spiritual progress at all. All you're doing is ticking off doing certain things, or perceiving that you've achieved certain things, where in actual fact you haven't, because it's vain glory, meaning it's superficial. And as I say, this is something particularly to be careful of in the spiritual life. So many people think they're doing good, think they're good because they do this and do that and so on and so forth, so they feel better for themselves, but actually they're not achieving actually anything. It's a vain glory. In fact, there's no glory in it at all, except for a misperception of it, self-achievement. But that's the thing, you see, it's self-achievement. That's why it's wrong. So pride, which is the last one, this is the mother of all vices, we might say. Indeed, in many ways, all the other passions, to some extent, are affected by pride, or infected by pride, or come from a place of pride. And it's ultimately about this sense of self. I'm going to quote here a German philosopher, Schopenhauer. Pride works from within. It is the direct appreciation of oneself. Vanity is the desire to arrive at this appreciation indirectly from without. So pride is self-sufficient and contained in the person, which makes it less prone to correction. Now, this is particularly an important passion and advice to address. I was going to say to be wary of, but we all have it. We're all prone to it. All of us, in varying degrees and on various levels, suffer from it, because it is, in one sense, on the one hand, this sense of self. But this is why, you see, the key from the gospel, the key to the Christian life, is what does our Lord say? If anyone would be a disciple of mine, he must deny himself first, take up his cross, and follow me. The key, the antithesis of pride is self-abnegation. The antithesis of pride is subjugation of one's will to God's. The alternative, the opposite to pride, is humility. And that's the most difficult virtue to inculcate. The most difficult virtue to grow and to manifest. Because pride is so, in one sense, is so deeply rooted, because it is this sense of self. Part of the reason why we struggle against pride, why we struggle against denial, self-denial, is because it goes against the grain. So I'm almost certain that your reaction, whenever you hear the phrase, deny yourself, is negative. Is it not? Whenever you've heard that phrase from the gospel read in church, perhaps, hasn't it always made you, even interiorly, sort of give a jerk reaction, sort of slap in the face? We hear it, but we don't want to do it. Must deny himself and follow me. Deny himself, self-denial. And the trouble is, of course, because all the other passions, and including pride, they all want to please us. See, they're all driven by self-satisfaction, self-gratification, self-pleasure. Pride is about our sense of self. Who am I? What am I? It's who I am. Pride is all about who I am. And the trouble is, of course, is that there is only one I am, God. Now, that's one of the giveaways about Christ's divinity, is the fact that so many times he refers to himself as I am. He does so deliberately, because the Jews at the time would know exactly what he meant, what he was saying about himself. I am is Yahweh, God's name. And here we see the spiritual dichotomy. Here we see the real battleground, the real war front within ourselves. Because we insist on saying, I am. What we should be striving to achieve, as we said last week, about me, myself, and I, about me, the physical, myself, the consciousness, and I becoming one, becoming whole, becoming perfect, becoming complete in He who is I am. becoming one then with the spirit of I am in us. That's how it should work. But the problem is, pride makes us think, I am, or I am, I am. And that's what we, in the Christian life, what we should be continually attacking is this sense of our own sense of self. And this is, straight away, this is goes totally against everything we hear in the world, particularly at the present moment. The world is forever telling you that you are I am. You are the center of your universe. You are the center of your world. You are the king of your own kingdom. And that's why, particularly at this present time, this identity politics, all about the assertion of I am. It's all about the assertion of pride. All about this sense of self. The truth of the matter is, of course, we are nothing without God, who is I am. As we said last week, if you take away God, you dehumanize yourself. When we look at atheist regimes who took away God, what happened? They dehumanized themselves. Society became dehumanized. Leaders started abusing their own populations because they dehumanize them. Because when you take God out, you have a warped understanding of who we are. And so we're seeing in our society today, this the abortion. This really is a manifestation of and a result of the vices and the passions. And one of the things, one of the arguments we're constantly told for it is the dehumanization of the unborn. It's not a human being, it's a zygote. It's not a human being, it's a clump of cells. It's not a life, because it's not living. It can't live by itself, it can't support itself. All these dehumanizing words. And the ills in our society, you see, we dehumanized the unborn. We dehumanized the other when we made them slaves. When we exploit others, we dehumanize them. When we're angry about someone, we dehumanize them. Suggest that they are less than human. Suggest that they are some subspecies of human. We do. Perhaps often we don't mean what we say, but nonetheless, we express it, we give vent to it. And more than we think, more than we're aware of, we dehumanize each other all the time. We dehumanize others all the time. And that's what ultimately, you see, prevents us from loving as God loves. You see, because God loves selflessly, God loves everyone equally. That's how we as Christians ought to be striving to love. But we allow these passions to get in the way. They prevent us ultimately from loving as God loves. Because pride, particularly of all the passions, gives us an over compensating sense of self. We make ourselves the center of our universe and of our kingdom, such that anybody outside of anybody else, unless they are useful to it, we don't pay them heed. And that is gluttony, that is greed, that is avarice, that is lust. All these things, you see, they dehumanize. They make us dehumanize each other because we become obsessed and then possessed with our own self-pleasure, with our own sense of self, which, as I say, is ultimately a false sense of self. But that's why, my brothers and sisters, that's until people know this, until people appreciate this and realize this and start to address this, this is why there will always be sin. This is why people will always be awful to each other. So when you hear me say, see now when you hear the scripture, God is love, and they who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. I hope now you understand better what that is trying to say. What it says, and what we should be striving to achieve. Because until we love as God loves, we will always treat each other simply as a means to our own end. The very notion of a stranger. Everyone is a stranger until they are useful to you. Everyone is a stranger unless something about them appeals to you, or they do something for you. You get something out of it. Our understanding of lust and love and relationships is all about take, receive. What can I get? How does it make me feel? What pleasure can I derive? How am I satisfied? And this ultimately, my brothers and sisters, is a corruption of humanity, a corruption of true self and true self-understanding and awareness. This is the problem. So often when we are making that split-second decision in the street about whether or not we're going to throw some change into a beggar's bowl, in that split second, you will weigh up what satisfaction, what positive result will this give for me? That's what you're thinking. Even, will it make myself feel better about myself? Instead of just giving for the sake of giving. You see, perhaps now you better understand St. Paul when he says, I can have faith to move mountains, I can do all this and everything else, but if I have not charity, if I have not true love, real love which is the nature of God, then it all means nothing. It all means nothing. Or where St. John Chrysostom says, if you don't recognize Christ in the beggar, you won't see him in the chalice. If you don't see with love, if you don't recognize love, how will you know love? How can you become love? And that ultimately is the purpose of our lives, actually. To give of ourselves selflessly. Well, I hope, my brothers and sisters, that was interesting. I hope that's been useful. Please feel free to send any questions via email. I see some of yeah. I should have put the banner up. Oh, here we go. I just need to edit that. Now, what I propose to do next week is perhaps to do a recap of everything, or try. We'll see. I'm not always very good at recap. Sometimes I'm very good, sometimes I'm not. We'll see. So please, review the previous episodes, because next week will be our 8th episode. And it may be that perhaps I've said enough for a while, and I will do something else, or perhaps you'd like to know more along these sort of lines. So perhaps you'd be good enough to let me know. So drop me an email, or if you've appreciated this series so far and you'd like it to continue, then please press the like button, the heart button, or leave a comment to say, thank you, please continue. Give me some feedback, folk. That would be good. And then we can collaboratively decide, as it were, where we might go next. But my intention has been to try, as it were, to reject otherwise what can be sometimes very complicated subjects, and try to make them as simple as possible by applying them, or by applying the simplicity of the gospel message to them. That's what I've been trying to do. So please let me know if I've been successful or not in trying to do that. So I'm conscious, both that I've been subtle, perhaps too subtle sometimes. I'm also conscious of the fact that I haven't gone into very great detail. But it's because what I've been wanting to do is really to simplify things to the bare bones, so that they are more easily appreciable, and hopefully have motivated you to think about them more for yourselves. So anyway, this was Late Night Catechism. Bless you, and thank you for watching. And I will see you soon, and hope to hear from you. Take care, and God bless.
Happiness, oh happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. Oh happiness, happiness, the greatest gift that I possess. I thank the Lord that I've been blessed with more than my share of happiness. I've got more than my share